In the summer of 1889, a devastating fire consumed the Whispering Pines orphanage in rural Vermont and exposed horrors that had been carefully hidden for nearly 2 decades behind a facade of Christian charity. When firefighters combed through the ruins, they found chilling evidence of systematic torture, cruel medical experiments, and severe child abuse, so shocking that the investigation was immediately classified to avoid mass panic. In the charred basement, they uncovered rooms lined with restraints, blood-stained instruments, and journals describing methods of breaking children under the guise of correcting their behavior. For over a century, the Burlington County Coroner's report remained sealed, but its contents confirmed that the bodies pulled from the ashes bore scars of deliberate physical and psychological torment carried out in the name of moral education. What state authorities buried in locked files? What local officials swore never to discuss, and what the few surviving children were forced into silence about, under threat of imprisonment, has remained one of the darkest secrets in Vermont's history. Before we continue with the haunting story of Whispering Pines and the children who endured its cruelty, know that the details you are about to hear have been drawn from recently declassified records and survivor accounts hidden away for more than 130 years. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit the notification bell so you never miss an investigation into the most shadowed corners of America's past, and let us know in the comments what city or state you are listening from, because we love seeing where our community of truth seekers lives around the world. Our trail to this story did not begin in Vermont, but deep within the archives of the Boston Medical Historical Society, where a simple cataloging project unearthed a forgotten leather-bound journal that revealed the horrifying truth about a place built to prey on the most vulnerable in the name of Christian discipline and scientific progress. Whispering Pines was founded in 1871 on the outskirts of Millbrook, Vermont, a town still reeling from the aftermath of the Civil War. The massive 3-story brick building funded by the Burlington Railroad Company and wealthy timber barons housed up to 50 children at a time, many of them war orphans, abandoned infants, and the unwanted children of families ruined by poverty and disease. The orphanage was the vision of Dr. Ezekiel Harrington, a former Union Army surgeon turned self-proclaimed child psychologist, and his wife Margaret. Unlike other institutions of the era that offered basic shelter and religious guidance, Whispering Pines advertised itself as a reform school for defective youth, promising to transform troubled children into good citizens through strict discipline and scientific methods. The town of Millbrook, with a population of just 847, according to the 1880 census, embraced the orphanage at first. Newspapers praised Harrington's progressive ideas, and prominent families donated money, believing they were supporting groundbreaking work. Articles in the Burlington Free Press celebrated Harrington as a pioneer in the scientific treatment of delinquent and morally deficient children. But beneath that glowing reputation lay a nightmare. The children were sorted into groups according to Harrington's judgment. Those considered mildly defective followed a harsh but ordinary orphanage routine. Those labeled severely compromised or likely to become criminals were subjected to his so-called special treatment program, a regime of relentless punishment, psychological manipulation, and experimentation that was nothing less than torture. The isolation of Whispering Pines made it the perfect place to hide these atrocities. The building sat 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a dirt road that winter snows often made impassable, and Harrington's word, there was law. State inspections required by Vermont law were staged performances. Only the healthier children were shown to officials, while those undergoing special treatment were locked away in the basement, unseen and unheard. Among the victims were 8-year-old Thomas Kellerman, sent there for disobedience after his father died in a mill accident. Sarah and Rebecca Dunham, twin sisters, condemned as morally deficient. After begging on the streets, young Marcus Trenton labeled mentally defective when he was in fact traumatized by watching his entire family die of tuberculosis and dozens of others whose only crime was having no home. Life at Whispering Pines depended entirely on which group a child was assigned to. For the fortunate few, it was an exhausting but ordinary existence, with dawn prayers at 5 lessons, in reading, writing, and arithmetic hours of work in the gardens or workshops, and more prayers before bed at 8. These children slept in dormitories, ate together in a dining hall, and sometimes even met families hoping to adopt. But for those condemned to special treatment, every day was a nightmare. They were locked away in small basement cells, Harrington called reflection chambers, windowless rooms barely big enough for a straw mattress with heavy wooden doors bolted from the outside, and a narrow slot through which food was shoved, cut off from the world and left to the mercy of a man who believed pain and fear were the path to salvation. The basement of Whispering Pines was deliberately kept cold and damp, its stone walls weeping moisture and its floors slick and wet. A place Dr. Harrington believed would humble the spirit and prepare the mind for what he called moral instruction. The true nature of his special treatment program was revealed only after the 1889 fire, when investigators unearthed a fireproof safe hidden beneath the orphanage's foundation. Inside, they found his meticulous handwritten logs detailing 18 years of cruelty disguised as science. These documents showed that his experiments always began with what he called baseline assessments, prolonged periods of isolation meant to crush a child's defenses and make them utterly dependent on his authority. Children chosen for this program were seized from their dormitories without warning, usually in the dead of night, and locked in the reflection chambers for weeks or even months. They were given nothing but bread and water once a day, and only if Harrington decided they were showing signs of repentance would he visit, plunging them into brief moments of dim light to conduct what he called moral examination sessions, where terrified children were forced to confess their wickedness and beg to be reformed. The case of Thomas Kellerman, admitted at 8 years old in 1875, was recorded in agonizing detail. At first labeled mildly defective for stealing food, Thomas was punished with 6 weeks of isolation when he was caught sharing bread with smaller children. Harrington's notes clinically described his decline. The boy shouted and resisted for days, but by the 2nd week, he grew silent. By the 3rd week, he began to answer with deference, and by day 35 he accepted that he was defective and expressed gratitude for the chance to be corrected. Once isolation had broken a child's spirit, Harrington moved to the next stage, which he called corrective conditioning. This was a series of punishments meant to erase behaviors he considered morally corrupt. Children caught lying endured truth conditioning, long sessions of forced false confessions, delivered under pain, until they could recite them with conviction. Those who expressed emotion were subjected to emotional regulation therapy, restrained and exposed to disturbing sounds and images until they were numb to the suffering of others. The most chilling method was pain conditioning. Affection between children was punished with electric shocks delivered by a crude device Harrington built from mail-order medical supplies. Curiosity was punished with ice baths that dropped body temperature to dangerous levels, and those who cried or showed fear were restrained and forced to face their deepest terrors until all outward signs of emotion disappeared. Sarah and Rebecca Dunham, twin sisters, admitted in 1978, became Harrington's favorite project because of their closeness to each other. His journals describe a process he called loyalty transfer conditioning. The girls were locked in neighboring cells where they could hear each other's screams during punishments, told that the only way to make it stop was to prove they no longer cared for each other. Over 8 long months, Harrington noted with satisfaction how the girls gradually fell silent, began reporting each other's smallest mistakes for tiny privileges, and finally reached a state where they could watch their twin being punished without a single tear. Subjects have successfully transferred their loyalty from each other to the institution, Harrington wrote. They now understand that emotional attachments are obstacles to moral development and have achieved the detachment necessary for proper social functioning. This campaign of torture disguised as education lasted for 18 years and destroyed the lives of hundreds of children whose only fault was being unwanted. If these revelations about the hidden history of American orphanages shock you, share your thoughts, because the truth we are uncovering was meant to stay buried. The full horror of Whispering Pines only became clear when investigators found another hidden section of the basement, a sealed medical wing built in 1876, where Dr. Harrington's cruelty escalated beyond psychological torment. Here he established what he called the Medical Research Division of his Special Treatment Program, a laboratory dedicated to proving that criminal behavior and moral weakness were rooted in the body and could be cut away. His notes describe a sequence of experiments that grew more invasive with time performed on children he deemed beyond saving through conditioning. These procedures, done in the name of science, pushed the limits of human endurance and ignored every boundary of medical ethics. The medical wing of Whispering Pines was a place of horror hidden behind locked doors, containing 3 treatment rooms fitted with iron surgical tables, crude restraint devices, and cabinets of sharp primitive instruments, many of them designed or altered by Dr. Harrington himself. Along the walls stood shelves of glass jars holding organs, tissue samples, and other specimens carved from the bodies of children. During his experiments, each labeled with the victim's age classification and the theory he sought to prove. Among the many children subjected to this nightmare was Marcus Trenton, a boy who had been labeled mentally defective simply because he had witnessed his entire family die. Dr. Harrington's experimental journals describe in cold clinical detail a series of brutal procedures inflicted on Marcus for 3 long years, beginning when he was only 9. Harrington believed that mental weakness was caused by an excess of fluid on the brain, and that drilling small holes in the skull could cure it. His handwritten surgical logs described the boy's first operation performed without anesthesia, so that the child would remain aware of every sensation. Subject displayed typical resistance to cranial access procedure, Harrington wrote, but achieved proper stillness once restraints were properly applied. Drilling proceeded smoothly, with subject maintaining consciousness throughout. Initial drainage of approximately 4 ounces of fluid produced immediate improvement in subject's compliance and attention span. Marcus survived, but over the months that followed, he was forced to endure more of these crude surgeries as Harrington adjusted his technique, each procedure erasing a little more of the boy's humanity. The logs note his gradual decline. First, his speech faltered, then his movements became clumsy, and finally his personality was hollowed out until nothing recognizable remained. Marcus's ordeal was only one of many. Over the years, dozens of children suffered similar fates as Harrington tested new theories about the biological roots of behavior. Those he considered too emotional had their tear ducts removed and their facial muscles cut so they could no longer cry or even show emotion. Children judged to be too restless or high-spirited were subjected to operations that damaged the parts of the brain that govern movement, leaving them slow, subdued, and broken. Alongside his surgeries, Harrington established a program he called pharmaceutical conditioning, experimenting with chemicals and drugs in an attempt to alter the very nature of a child's mind. His laboratory shelves were crammed with bottles of strange compounds he had mixed himself or acquired through correspondence with like-minded researchers across the country. His detailed drug logs reveal that children as young as 6 were forced to ingest these substances, their reactions studied with cold fascination. Some were given drugs that paralyzed them, so he could study the effects of helplessness. Others were dosed with hallucinogens that caused terrible visions, as Harrington recorded every word of their confused babbling, believing he might access their innermost thoughts. One of his longest experiments involved 12 children who were made to take a daily dose of what he called moral clarification serum, a toxic mixture of opium derivatives, mercury, and plant extracts. For 6 months, these children wasted away under constant surveillance, their nervous systems failing as paralysis crept through their bodies until one by one they died. In his notes, Harrington displayed no sense of pity or remorse. Subjects in the moral clarification study have demonstrated conclusively that criminal tendencies can be eliminated through pharmaceutical intervention, he wrote. While the current compound requires refinement to reduce mortality rates, the fundamental principle has been validated. Future research should focus on developing more precise dosages that achieve behavioral modification without terminal side effects. His pages are filled with clinical descriptions of suffering of children convulsing and crying out, their bodies racked by seizures as if they were little more than lab animals. He cataloged which drugs best suppressed fear, which destroyed curiosity, and which erased every trace of individuality. Even more disturbing, his letters revealed that he was not alone. Hidden among the recovered papers was an extensive correspondence with other doctors, psychiatrists, and administrators of institutions across New England and the mid-Atlantic states. These letters described a network of men who shared methods and results, who encouraged each other's experiments, and who were united in the belief that the minds and bodies of children could be reshaped to conform to their vision of morality. One letter dated March 1883 from a man signing himself Dr. Wilhelm K. at an institution in Pennsylvania praised Harrington's work with cranial pressure relief and explained their own work on something called moral lobotomy, a procedure that severed parts of the brain to destroy personality and remove all criminal instincts. Our own experiments with selective brain tissue removal have produced remarkable improvements in subject compliance. Though we have observed that complete personality elimination occasionally occurs, Dr. K wrote, we have found that subjects who undergo total personality removal require minimal supervision and can perform simple labor tasks indefinitely without displaying any criminal or antisocial behaviors. The letters made one thing painfully clear. Whispering Pines was not an isolated case of abuse, but a central hub in a secret network of institutions where the most vulnerable children were sacrificed in the name of science and social improvement. When journalist Marcus Wheeler of the Burlington Free Press began combing through the recovered documents after the fire, he realized that the orphanage had been functioning as a laboratory for a hidden society of physicians and administrators who believed they could re-engineer childhood itself. Wheeler's investigation uncovered that the experiments at Whispering Pines had never been funded solely by charitable donations, as the orphanage claimed. Hidden financial records retrieved from the fireproof safe revealed a steady stream of money from medical schools, pharmaceutical companies, and wealthy benefactors who shared an interest in what they called criminal anthropology and the elimination of hereditary vice. These payments came with conditions. A contract dated 1879 between Dr. Harrington and the Boston Medical Research Foundation demanded proof that he could re-engineer juvenile delinquents, requiring complete elimination of antisocial behaviors, absolute obedience to institutional authority, and the ability to perform labor without needing supervision or reward. To deliver on these demands, Harrington formalized a brutal system that began the moment a child entered Whispering Pines. Every new arrival was evaluated and assigned a reformation score based on family history, physical traits, and behavioral assessments. Those with the lowest scores were automatically marked as experimental candidates destined for the most invasive procedures. Wheeler discovered that the glowing reports sent to these funding organizations were a lie. The documents he unearthed revealed that while Harrington's internal logs were filled with descriptions of deaths, severe disabilities, and permanent psychological damage, his official reports transformed these tragedies into tales of success. Children who had been shattered by his experiments were presented to visitors and state inspectors as proof that his methods worked. Their silence, their docile behavior, their inability to show emotion, these became evidence of rehabilitation. Thomas Kellerman, who could no longer speak or feed himself after Harrington's conditioning, was shown as a model case of a boy reformed from a life of theft. Sarah Dunham, stripped of all emotion after loyalty transfer conditioning, was presented as a shining example of a girl saved from unhealthy dependency. When questioned about their vacant stares and slow movements, Harrington reassured his visitors that these were temporary effects of the reformation process. Wheeler's investigation went even further. He discovered records of children who never appeared again in any report, not as reformed, not as adopted, not as runaways. These were the ones who died during experiments. Their deaths were covered up with falsified reports attributed to pneumonia, tuberculosis, or heart failure. In reality, they had died from brain damage caused by crude surgeries, from organ failure, triggered by experimental drugs, or from untreated infections following his mutilations. Many died simply from starvation, cold, and relentless psychological torture. Harrington's logs show no regret. Subject number 47 expired during the third cranial pressure relief procedure. One entry reads, "But the preliminary results from the first two operations provide valuable data for refining the technique. Future subjects should undergo more extensive preparation to improve survival rates while maintaining the beneficial effects on behavioral compliance." The investigation then revealed something even darker. Dr. Harrington had been selling children from Whispering Pines to other researchers. Financial records documented payments for subject transfers to institutions in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York, where these children were subjected to further experimental procedures. These transfers were arranged through a clandestine network that Harrington called the Scientific Advancement Society, an organized circle of physicians and researchers who shared techniques, funding, and human subjects in their pursuit of reshaping human behavior. Using coded correspondence, the society arranged to move children between institutions without the knowledge of state authorities. Those selected were told they were being sent to a better orphanage or to meet a family interested in adopting them. But the truth was far more sinister. They were delivered into the hands of other experimenters for procedures so dangerous and extreme that even Harrington avoided them. The transfer logs describe advanced cranial modifications, heavy pharmaceutical conditioning, and full behavioral reconstruction programs with mortality rates that approached 100%. This network, as Wheeler's research made clear, represented a nationwide conspiracy that linked some of the most respected medical and academic figures in 19th century America. A hidden system where the most powerless children were sacrificed under the guise of science and progress. And while this evidence shocked the public when it was finally revealed, Wheeler had not yet reached the most horrifying discovery of all. The final chapter of Whispering Pines and the collapse of Dr. Harrington's reign of terror was not brought about by state authorities or brave whistleblowers, but by the children themselves, who in the end took their fate into their own hands. Wheeler's investigation revealed that the fire that consumed the orphanage in 1889 was no accident. It was the desperate, deliberate act of the very children Harrington had spent years trying to break. For months, a small group of survivors, those who had endured his experiments but retained enough strength of mind to think and plan, had conspired to burn the institution to the ground. At the center of this plan was Elizabeth Crane, a 16-year-old girl who had been trapped inside Whispering Pines for 8 years. Harrington had spent 3 years attempting to crush her will through repeated pharmaceutical experiments, trying to erase what he called her dangerous leadership tendencies. His drugs left her body partially paralyzed, her hands stiff, her legs unsteady. But her intelligence and spirit remained untouched. Alongside 5 other damaged survivors, Elizabeth crafted a plan that was as bold as it was final. Burn the orphanage, kill their tormentors, and make sure the truth could never again be hidden. Over weeks, they scavenged lamp oil matches and scraps of wood and fabric, hiding them in forgotten corners of the basement. They learned every hallway and door, every draft and choke point in the sprawling building, choosing the places where flames would spread fastest while giving themselves time to flee. Most importantly, they prepared the evidence. Using keys stolen from Harrington's office, they entered the basement laboratory and carefully arranged its horrors so that investigators could not fail to understand what had been happening there. They gathered experimental logs, bottles of preserved tissue, and the instruments of torture that Harrington had called medical equipment, and left them where the fire would not destroy them. They even moved the most damning records into a fireproof safe and hid it beneath the floor. And in secret, with broken hands and shaking fingers, they wrote their own testimonies, dozens of pages describing every procedure, every beating, every experiment, leaving copies in multiple rooms so that no matter what burned, their voices would survive. On the night of June 23rd, 1889, they struck. Fires erupted almost simultaneously in the kitchen, the dining hall, and the offices, quickly spreading through the building. Smoke rolled through the halls before Harrington and his staff understood what was happening. By the time they realized the orphanage was doomed, the stairways and upper levels were already burning. Harrington, his wife, and the 2 assistants who had helped him in his experiments were driven downward into the basement, exactly where the conspirators intended. Trapped among the very tools of their cruelty, they died there when the flames reached them. Elizabeth and 4 of her allies slipped away into the surrounding forest, where they had hidden food and supplies days before. One conspirator did not make it out. Marcus Trenton, the boy destroyed by Harrington's brain surgeries, was too disabled to move and died in the blaze along with several others locked in the reflection chambers. The fire was devastating, but when the smoke cleared, the ruins gave up everything Elizabeth had hoped they would. Investigators found the fireproof safe still intact, filled with Harrington's experimental logs, detailing hundreds of procedures on dozens of children. The remains of the basement laboratory, half collapsed, but not entirely consumed, revealed the equipment, the preserved organs, the jars and notebooks that made plain the true nature of Whispering Pines. And scattered throughout the wreckage were the handwritten testimonies Elizabeth and the others had left behind, detailed first-hand accounts of systematic torture disguised as education. These accounts, verified against Harrington's own records, painted a picture so horrific that state authorities moved quickly to bury the entire truth, sealing the evidence and swearing those involved to silence to prevent public outrage and protect the reputation of Vermont's child welfare system. Elizabeth Crane's own testimony, written in a painfully careful hand despite her crippled fingers, became the clearest record of what had happened within those walls. In it, she described 18 years of cruelty disguised as science, and the way Harrington viewed every child not as a life, but as a subject, a defective thing to be fixed or discarded. Dr. Harrington believed that children like us were born broken, she wrote, and that it was his Christian duty to either fix our defects or document our failure to be reformed for the benefit of science. He told us we were fortunate to serve a purpose greater than our worthless lives, and that our suffering was necessary to prevent other children from being born like us. Her words described a grim pattern that every child at Whispering Pines came to know days after arrival. They would be dragged to the reflection chambers, locked in the cold dark, until every spark of resistance was crushed. When they finally emerged, they were quieter, emptier shadows of who they had been. Those who caught his attention again, those who dared to disobey or stand out, were taken into the next phase of experiments from which there was no return. Those who survived the reflection chambers learned quickly that the only safety left to them was invisibility. Any spark of independence, any flash of curiosity, brought swift punishment and selection for what Dr. Harrington called advanced treatment. Elizabeth Crane's testimony, which survived the fire, laid bare the full horror of what that meant. She wrote of the surgeries he performed on children's brains because he believed criminal thoughts were physical defects that could be cut away. He would drill holes into our skulls. While we were awake, Elizabeth recounted insisting that we had to remain conscious so he could see the results of his work as he carved into us. Many never survived those crude operations. Those who did were left broken, unable to walk, speak, or feed themselves. The pharmaceutical experiments were no less terrifying. He tested hundreds of drugs on us, Elizabeth wrote. Children were given drugs that caused seizures, paralysis, hallucinations, and death. He watched everything, writing down every detail of our suffering, treating our pain as if it were just useful data. Her testimony also revealed the way Harrington used psychological manipulation as a tool of control, convincing the children that they were monsters who could never be accepted by the outside world. He told us that normal people would never allow us to live among them. She wrote that our only chance to be worthy of existence was to endure his experiments. He made us believe he was saving us from a fate worse than death. More devastating still was her description of how he deliberately destroyed their ability to trust or care for one another. Children who showed kindness to others were separated, Elizabeth wrote. He conditioned us until we were incapable of forming friendships or love. He wanted us alone, dependent on him, and too broken to resist. Other survivors added their own voices to her account. James Fletcher, a boy who had endured 3 years of pharmaceutical conditioning, described what it felt like to lose himself. I can remember being someone else before the treatments, but those memories feel like they belong to another person. His drugs didn't just change my behavior, they erased who I was inside. Mary Sinclair, who endured loyalty transfer conditioning like the Dunham twins, explained how emotional bonds were torn apart. He made us watch as others were punished and rewarded us for staying silent. He taught us that caring was a weakness. By the end, we could not feel anything not for others and not even for ourselves. Their testimonies confirmed that Harrington's cruelty did not end at the walls of Whispering Pines. Children who survived his first round of treatments were sometimes transferred to other institutions where experiments were more extreme. "We knew that children chosen for transfer never came back," Elizabeth wrote. "But refusing to go meant punishments worse than anything we could imagine." Even more damning was the evidence that this program had not been hidden from the authorities. Elizabeth's account described how officials came for scheduled inspections, were shown only carefully selected parts of the orphanage, and never once asked to see the basement or speak to the children undergoing treatments. "They never questioned why so many of us could barely speak or feel," she wrote. The financial ledgers recovered from the safe proved she was telling the truth. Payments from state agencies, medical institutions, and private foundations openly funded Harrington's work, specifying that he document behavioral modification and reformation outcomes as conditions of their support. Whispering Pines was not the madness of a single man. It was a carefully maintained system built on official approval and institutional funding. The exposure of Harrington's program after the fire ignited a scandal that reached far beyond Vermont. Congressional hearings would later confront the brutal truth about the treatment of children in such institutions and the unchecked medical experiments that had been hidden under the mask of reform. The evidence pulled from the ruins of Whispering Pines revealed a truth that reached far beyond Vermont. It showed in cold detail that the horror carried out there had been funded, sanctioned, and hidden by some of the most powerful institutions in America. Prominent medical schools, government agencies, and philanthropic foundations had all supported a network of cruelty that stretched across the Northeast. When Marcus Wheeler began publishing his series of exposés in the autumn of 1889, the country could no longer look away. Backed by the testimonies of Elizabeth Crane and the other survivors, Wheeler's articles exposed a vast system in which hundreds of children had been tortured, experimented on, and conditioned under the guise of science and Christian morality. The response was immediate and furious. Within weeks of the first article, 14 institutions tied to Harrington's research network were closed. Federal investigators, armed with the documents and testimonies salvaged from Whispering Pines, swept through orphanages, reformatories, and private hospitals in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, and Maine. What they found echoed the basement of Whispering Pines' locked rooms, hidden laboratories, and children reduced to subjects in experiments. Raids ended with 23 arrests for unauthorized human experimentation, though few of those responsible spent long in prison. Their connections to universities and medical boards protected them even as their victims were left scarred for life. Elizabeth Crane, despite the permanent damage Harrington's drugs had done to her body, refused to be silenced. Her testimony before Congress laid bare everything she had witnessed. In clear and deliberate words, she described how the state itself had paid for these atrocities and how inspectors and officials had looked the other way. Her courage, joined by the voices of other survivors, forced the passage of new laws that established federal oversight of every institution that housed children, and for the first time legal protections for minors in medical research. Investigators also uncovered the staggering financial scale of the program. Records seized from institutions across the network revealed that Harrington and his collaborators had received more than $2 million in funding from the U.S. Army Medical Department, several elite universities, and wealthy donors who believed they were supporting groundbreaking research. When these names appeared before Congress, the hearings became a reckoning, dragging into the light how deeply respected institutions had been complicit in the suffering of children. Out of this scandal came legal precedents that still define how children in care are treated. Elizabeth's words and those of her fellow survivors shaped federal standards that demanded independent oversight, placed strict limits on medical experimentation and established the rights of children to refuse treatments that put them in harm's way. The children who walked out of Whispering Pines bore scars that would never fade, but some of them built new lives from what was left. Elizabeth, despite the paralysis that slowed her hands, finished. Her education became a nurse and spent her life fighting for children who had been abused by the systems that were meant to protect them. James Fletcher, whose sense of self had been nearly destroyed by pharmaceutical conditioning, devoted his life to advocating for victims of unethical medical research. Mary Sinclair, once stripped of all human connection, slowly learned to trust again and created a support network for survivors like her. The orphanage itself was never rebuilt. Its ruins stood for decades, on the edge of Millbrook, the blackened stone and shattered walls, a silent witness to what had been done there. Even into the 20th century, locals said the remains of the basement still held traces of Harrington's laboratory. In 1925, after years of effort by Elizabeth and other survivors, the land was finally cleared and turned into a memorial park. At its center stands a simple stone monument bearing the names of more than 200 children who died during Harrington's reign. Carved into its face are Elizabeth's own words, in memory of the children who suffered at this place and in honor of those who survived to tell their story. May their voices ensure that such horrors are never again inflicted on the innocent in the name of science, charity, or moral improvement. The legacy of Whispering Pines did not end with the closing of the orphanage or the arrests that followed. Its impact stretched far beyond Millbrook, shaping the future of medicine law and child welfare in ways that still resonate today. What happened there became a turning point in the history of medical ethics, forcing the country to confront the dangers of unchecked authority in the name of science. The testimonies of Elizabeth Crane and the other survivors became foundational documents studied by doctors, psychologists, and lawmakers. They established principles for informed consent, the protection of vulnerable populations, and strict oversight of experimental research principles that remain central to modern medical practice. Psychologists and social workers, moved by the haunting details of the survivors' experiences, began to build new models of trauma-informed care, shaping how institutions help children recover from abuse. Wheeler's investigation revealed another truth: how deeply respected institutions had been willing to ignore, even excuse, the suffering of children when research interests or reputations were at stake. The letters and records seized from Whispering Pines and from the homes and offices of Harrington's collaborators exposed a network that treated the deaths and disabilities of children as acceptable losses. This revelation led to the creation of ethics review boards in universities and medical schools charged with ensuring that vulnerable populations would never again be exploited so easily. The scandal also stripped away the polished veneer of many powerful organizations. Wealthy families whose money had built Whispering Pines were forced into the open, their correspondence with Harrington making clear that they had known and had chosen to look away. Several of them were compelled to fund compensation programs for the survivors. The Boston Medical Research Foundation, which had poured money into Harrington's work for years, collapsed after congressional hearings revealed that its directors had received detailed reports of the deaths and injuries at Whispering Pines, and had kept sending money anyway. The damage spread beyond the United States. Wheeler's research uncovered evidence that Harrington had been exchanging ideas and methods with institutions in Europe and beyond, where similar programs were already underway. The fallout from the Whispering Pines scandal helped shape international protocols for the protection of human research subjects. Its lessons echo decades later in the Nuremberg Code and in global standards for medical research. Today, the name Whispering Pines is taught in medical schools, social work programs, and ethics courses around the world as a case study in how institutions created to protect can become engines of harm when no one is watching. Elizabeth Crane's testimony, preserved in the congressional record and academic archives, is still read aloud by teachers and professors. Through her words, the children who died there, Marcus, Trenton, Sarah, and Rebecca Dunham, and so many others, are remembered not just as victims, but as voices that forced a reckoning. The tragedy of Whispering Pines endures as a permanent warning. It shows how easily systems built on good intentions can become tools of abuse when power is unchecked and when vulnerable lives are treated as expendable in the pursuit of science, morality, or progress. And it shows what a single voice, even a wounded one, can achieve. Despite the damage she carried for the rest of her life, Elizabeth Crane refused to be silent. She turned her suffering into testimony, her testimony into reform, and her reform into a shield for generations of children yet to come. The story of Whispering Pines is not just about what was lost. It is also about the courage it takes to make sure such a place can never rise again. See you in the next video, where we'll continue uncovering the dark secrets that powerful institutions tried to hide from history.